Most people think they know why the Ottoman Empire collapsed. They picture a once mighty power grown soft and corrupt, outpaced by European military technology, weighed down by internal decay, earning the nickname history remembers it by the sick man of Europe. It's a clean story with a clear explanation, decline through weakness, a slow fade from greatness into irrelevance. But here's the problem. That story is dangerously incomplete, and in some ways, it's flat out wrong. Military weakness did not cause the Ottoman Empire's collapse into foreign financial control. Let me say that again, because it matters. Military decline was real, and it mattered. But the mechanism that actually stripped the Ottoman state of its financial sovereignty wasn't a lost battle. It was a debt structure, deliberately engineered by European bankers and quietly enforced by European governments, that eventually handed direct control over huge portions of the empire's own tax revenue to foreign bondholders, decades before a single shot of the First World War was fired. What actually happened to Ottoman finances in the second half of the 19th century is a far darker, more complicated, and more human story than you've been taught. It involves a war loan issued at a steep, hidden discount that European banks profited from before a single soldier was paid. A sultan whose palace-building spree rivaled the debts of entire nations. A default that European powers used not to forgive the empire, but to formalize control over it. And a foreign-run administration, staffed largely by Europeans, that was granted direct authority to collect specific Ottoman taxes on salt, tobacco, silk, and fishing, straight from Ottoman soil, to guarantee payments to bondholders in London and Paris. The Ottoman Empire wasn't simply defeated militarily and left to decline. A significant part of its sovereignty was, quite literally, foreclosed on. And the most unsettling part is that the exact financial mechanism used against the Ottomans became a template, refined and repeated, in debt arrangements imposed on weaker economies for the century that followed. So let's go back, not to the empire's final collapse after the First World War, but much further, because the true origin of the Ottoman debt trap doesn't start with decline. It starts with a war the empire didn't have the money to fight. For nearly 5 centuries, the Ottoman Empire had operated largely without foreign debt. Its finances were far from perfectly managed, but the state financed itself through its own tax base, land revenues, and internal borrowing. That changed permanently in 1854 during the Crimean War, when the Ottoman Empire, fighting alongside Britain and France against Russia, took out its first ever foreign loan. The loan itself, arranged through British and French banking houses, was for £3 million sterling. On paper, this looks like a straightforward wartime financing arrangement. In practice, it established a pattern that would define Ottoman finance for the next 60 years. The bonds were issued at a substantial discount to their face value, meaning the Ottoman treasury received considerably less cash up front than the amount it was legally obligated to repay, while European banking houses and early bondholders who purchased at the discounted issue price stood to profit handsomely once the bonds were repaid at full value, or traded at improved prices as the empire's short-term war needs made repayment appear more urgent and therefore more reliable to investors. This 1854 loan was explicitly framed, both by Ottoman officials and their European allies, as a temporary wartime necessity. What nobody fully reckoned with at the time was how quickly and how permanently it would open the door to continuous foreign borrowing, because once the pattern was established, both the Ottoman government and European financial markets discovered it could be extraordinarily lucrative to keep repeating. Here is where the story gets deeply strange, and where most conventional retellings of Ottoman decline miss the mark entirely. Because between 1854 and 1875, the Ottoman Empire took out at least 14 separate foreign loans, and the terms of these loans grew progressively more exploitative rather than more favorable, even as the empire's finances grew more precarious. Ottoman bonds were frequently issued at discounts that, once banking commissions, brokerage fees, and other charges were deducted, meant the Ottoman treasury often received well under 60% of a loan's nominal face value in actual usable cash, while remaining legally obligated to repay the full 100% plus interest, often at rates well above what more creditworthy European governments were paying on their own debt at the time. Financial historians studying this period have calculated that across the full run of Ottoman borrowing in this era, the effective cost of capital to the Ottoman treasury, once these discounts and fees are properly accounted for, frequently exceeded 12 to 15% annually, an extraordinarily punishing rate for a sovereign government, especially when compared to the roughly 3 to 4% that Britain or France were paying on their own comparable debt at the time. European banking houses, most prominently French and British institutions with deep connections to their own governments, actively competed for the business of underwriting these loans, because even accounting for genuine default risk, the fees and discounted issuance terms made Ottoman lending remarkably profitable, particularly for the intermediary banks arranging each issuance, who collected substantial commissions regardless of how the loan ultimately performed for the Ottoman state itself. Now, let's talk about where a significant portion of this borrowed money actually went, because this is the part of the story that popular retellings tend to treat as a minor footnote about corruption, when it deserves to be understood as a direct and substantial driver of the debt crisis itself. Sultan Abdulaziz, who reigned from 1861 to 1876, presided over an era of extraordinary palace construction and personal expenditure, financed substantially through continued foreign borrowing. The Dolmabahce Palace complex and subsequent palace projects, along with a rapidly expanding personal household and military modernization efforts that were often more about prestige than practical defense capability, consumed enormous sums. Contemporary and later historical estimates suggest that a very large share, plausibly more than half, of the money raised through Ottoman foreign borrowing in this period went toward non-productive spending, palace construction, court expenses, and debt service on previous loans, rather than toward infrastructure, industry, or economic development that might have generated the revenue needed to actually repay what was being borrowed. This created an unmistakable pattern that European bondholders and the banking houses arranging these loans understood clearly, even if it was rarely stated so bluntly in official communications. The Ottoman state was increasingly borrowing not to invest in its own economic capacity, but simply to service its existing debt and sustain court spending, a structure that made eventual default not just likely, but in retrospect, close to mathematically inevitable. By 1875, total Ottoman foreign debt had ballooned to roughly 200 million Ottoman lira, an amount so large relative to the empire's actual tax revenue that annual debt service alone was consuming more than half of total state income. In October 1875, facing an impossible fiscal position, the Ottoman government announced it could no longer make full payments on its foreign debt, a decree that became known as the Ramazan Karar Namizi, effectively cutting interest payments in half and suspending a portion of principal repayment. This default, unsurprisingly, triggered outrage among European bondholders, particularly in France and Britain, where Ottoman bonds had been widely sold to ordinary middle-class investors alongside major institutions, meaning the political pressure on European governments to intervene on behalf of bondholders came not just from banks, but from a genuinely broad base of angry domestic investors who had lost money. What followed in the next several years compounded the crisis dramatically. In 1876, amid the fiscal collapse, Sultan Abdulaziz was deposed and died under still disputed circumstances shortly afterward, followed by a brief and troubled reign by Sultan Murad Faif, who was himself removed within months before Sultan Abdulhamid II took the throne. Then, in 1877, the Ottoman Empire was drawn into a devastating war with Russia, the Russo-Turkish War, which further drained an already exhausted treasury and resulted in significant territorial losses formalized at the Congress of Berlin in 1878, losses that also meant the empire lost tax-generating territory precisely when it desperately needed revenue to service its defaulted debt. This is the moment that deserves to be far better known than it typically is, because it represents one of the most direct and formally documented transfers of fiscal sovereignty from a struggling state to its foreign creditors in modern history. In December 1881, under sustained diplomatic and financial pressure from the major European powers holding Ottoman debt, the Ottoman government issued the Decree of Muharrem, formally establishing the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, known in Ottoman Turkish as the Duyun-u Umumiye. This was not simply a renegotiation of interest rates or a repayment schedule. It created an entirely new administrative body, run substantially by European representatives of the bondholders themselves, with direct authority to collect specific categories of Ottoman state revenue at the source, and to channel that revenue directly toward debt repayment before it ever reached the Ottoman treasury's general accounts. The revenue streams placed under this foreign-administered body included the salt monopoly, the tobacco tax, the stamp duty, the silk tithe from several provinces, and fishing taxes, among others, collectively representing a very substantial portion of total Ottoman state revenue. In 1883, the Public Debt Administration went a step further, establishing the Régie des Tabacs, a European-run company granted a monopoly over the entire Ottoman tobacco trade, from cultivation through sale, specifically to secure and expand the revenue stream dedicated to bondholder payments. By the 1880s and 1890s, the Ottoman Public Debt Administration employed a staff numbering in the thousands, larger in raw headcount than many actual departments of the Ottoman government itself, and it operated with a degree of administrative independence and enforcement authority, including its own agents empowered to collect these designated taxes directly from Ottoman subjects, that made it, in practical terms, a parallel financial government operating within the empire, answerable not to the Sultan, but substantially to European bondholder representatives. Now, let me bring all of these threads together, because the true mechanism behind the Ottoman Empire's financial subjugation is not captured by any single explanation, whether that's military weakness or vague cultural decline. But, by the way, a deliberately structured debt system converted a wartime financing need into permanent foreign control over the empire's core revenue. You had a single wartime loan in 1854 that established a pattern of foreign borrowing the empire had never previously needed. You had 14 subsequent loans issued at punishing effective interest rates, structured in ways that generated substantial guaranteed profit for European banking houses, regardless of how well the underlying Ottoman economy actually performed. You had a sultan whose palace spending consumed a large share of borrowed funds that should have gone toward productive investment capable of generating the revenue needed to repay what was borrowed. You had a default in 1875 that arrived not as an isolated crisis, but as the almost mathematically predictable outcome of a debt structure that had never been sustainable. You had a disastrous war with Russia that further devastated Ottoman finances at precisely the moment recovery was most needed. And you had the Decree of Muharrem in 1881, which formalized foreign control over the empire's own tax collection through an administrative body that functioned, in effect, as a parallel government answerable to European bondholders rather than to the Ottoman state itself. Each of these factors alone might have produced a manageable fiscal crisis. Together, they produced something considerably more consequential: the direct transfer of substantial fiscal sovereignty from a sovereign state to its foreign creditors, formalized in an official decree operating in plain sight for decades and rarely given the central place in the empire's decline that the documented financial record actually supports. What conventional history gets wrong, time and again, is folding this entire story into a vague narrative about the sick man of Europe, slowly and passively decaying. That framing isn't just incomplete, it obscures the fact that a very specific, deliberately structured financial mechanism actively accelerated and formalized the empire's loss of sovereignty years before any of the territorial and military defeats most people associate with the empire's final collapse. When we talk about tax collection being placed under foreign administration, that phrase doesn't capture what it actually felt like to live under it. They don't capture the Anatolian farmers who found agents of a foreign-administered bureaucracy collecting silk and produced taxes directly from their villages, often with little regard for local harvest conditions or genuine ability to pay, because the public debt administration's institutional priority was guaranteeing bondholder payments in London and Paris, not the welfare of the peasants whose labor generated the underlying revenue. They don't capture the tobacco farmers across Ottoman territories whose entire livelihood was reshaped almost overnight once the Régie des Tabacs monopoly took control of the trade in 1883, dictating prices in terms that historians studying the period have documented as frequently leaving small producers with sharply reduced income compared to the pre-monopoly market. They don't capture the broader economic stagnation that historians have linked to this period, as a substantial share of Ottoman state revenue was permanently diverted away from infrastructure, education, and industrial development, and toward debt service for loans that had, in significant part, financed palace construction rather than economic capacity. Some historians, studying the roots of the Young Turk movement and the broader wave of Ottoman nationalist and reformist sentiment that emerged in the following decades, have specifically pointed to resentment over foreign financial control, alongside broader grievances, as a contributing factor in the political radicalization that eventually helped drive the empire toward the alliance decisions that led it into the catastrophic losses of the First World War and its final dissolution in 1922. This is a pattern that should feel uncomfortably familiar to anyone following sovereign debt crises in the developing world today. A country facing an urgent short-term financing need takes on debt with terms that appear manageable at signing, but that carry effective costs far higher than the headline interest rate suggests once fees, discounts, and conditions are properly accounted for. Borrowed funds go disproportionately toward politically prestigious projects, rather than the kind of productive investment that would generate the revenue needed for eventual repayment. And when default finally arrives, the resolution imposed by creditor nations frequently involves not debt forgiveness, but direct external control over specific revenue-generating sectors of the debtor economy. An arrangement modern economists and journalists have increasingly come to describe using the term debt trap, a phrase whose modern usage, whatever its contemporary political context, describes almost precisely the mechanism first formalized against the Ottoman Empire in the Decree of Muharrem more than 140 years ago. The conventional story of Ottoman decline is comforting in a way. It tells us a once great empire simply grew weak, outpaced by more modern rivals, fading gradually into irrelevance through forces largely beyond anyone's deliberate control. It implies the empire's loss of sovereignty was primarily a story about military and technological gaps. But the real story is far less reassuring. The real story is that a very specific financial architecture, built loan by loan, discount by discount, through decades of borrowing that primarily benefited European banking houses and financed palace extravagance rather than economic development, formally stripped the Ottoman state of control over core sectors of its own economy through an internationally sanctioned administrative body that operated for decades, collecting Ottoman taxes on behalf of foreign bondholders. That's the real lesson of the Ottoman debt trap. Not that empires decline, they always eventually do. The lesson is that the mechanism of decline matters enormously, and that a debt structure engineered to be unsustainable from the outset can accomplish something that armies alone often cannot: the formal, legally documented surrender of a state's control over its own economy, negotiated one loan at a time, until the debtor discovers there was never a realistic path back out. So the next time someone tells you the Ottoman Empire simply declined because it grew weak and outdated, you'll know better. You'll know that decades before its final collapse, a very specific and deliberately structured debt system had already taken direct control of huge portions of its economy, formalized in an official decree that most popular history simply skips over entirely. If this story reshaped the way you think about how empires actually lose their sovereignty, take a moment and hit that subscribe button. We go deep on the forces that actually move markets, nations, and the global order, the kind of stories that don't make the evening news but quietly shape the world you live in. Drop a comment below with your take. Was it the punishing loan terms, the palace spending, or the Decree of Muharrem itself that mattered most in the Ottoman Empire's loss of financial sovereignty? I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video. It genuinely helps the channel reach more people who care about understanding how money and power actually work. I'll see you in the next one.